You were never meant to hear this. Not the true version. Not the version sealed in family vaults, redacted in court ledgers, whispered only by dying men who regret nothing except being born too late to stop it. But listen closely. Because once I start, you won't be able to go back to the surface world. You'll feel the floor tilt. The air will thicken, and the part of you that still believes in normal will start to die. Picture a barn, nothing special at first glance. Weather-worn wood, the smell of tobacco bleeding from its walls, the same kind of structure that dotted every plantation road in 1840s Virginia. But inside this one, there was no tobacco, no workers, no overseer. Just a secret universe built plank by plank, night after night, by a son who refused the rules of the world his father owned. 3 women lived there, not hidden in chains, but hidden in choice. Enslaved by law, but not by allegiance, and with them 2 children and 1 unborn. A forbidden household, a silent rebellion, a future that should have been impossible in a land where bloodlines were currency and love was a crime. The father, Abraham Sutherland, didn't just own land. He owned narrative, reputation, the social skeleton of a county where every handshake, every marriage, every rumor had economic weight. He controlled it all, until the day he opened that barn door and saw what his son had built in defiance of everything. And here's the truth men rarely admit. He wasn't horrified because it was immoral. He was horrified because it was out of his control. His son had created a world outside the one that made Abraham powerful. No ledger, no permission, no profit. That moment, frozen in the dust lit dark of a barn, wasn't just a scandal. It was a glitch in the system. A son refusing to be a mirror of his father, and 3 enslaved women refusing to remain unnamed bodies in someone else's inventory. That was the crime, not lust, not secrecy, autonomy. And for men like Abraham Sutherland, autonomy was treason. What followed wasn't punishment. It was restoration of power. A public ritual designed to shatter dignity and baptize the county back into its hierarchy. Because when power feels threatened, it doesn't just correct, it performs. And the performance would take place in the town square, before the entire county, before God, before history. And the father would make sure no one ever forgot what happens when a man creates love where the world demands ownership. Abraham didn't explode. He didn't shout. He didn't drag his son out by the collar or call for the whip. Men with real power don't waste energy on rage. They calculate. And that's what he did, standing in the doorway of that barn, eyes scanning not just the bodies in front of him, but the implications. 3 enslaved women, living as wives, children born outside the slave quarters, raised on ceramic plates instead of tin bowls, a son willingly dissolving the boundary between master and property. That wasn't scandal. That was insurrection disguised as intimacy. You have to understand the era in 1847 Virginia. The most dangerous weapon a white hair could wield wasn't a gun or a knife. It was affection. Because affection made slaves into people, and turning property into people could burn an entire economic order to the ground. One man in love was a threat. One man building a family across the color line was a contagion. Abraham saw it instantly. His son wasn't a sinner, he was a problem. A problem that threatened lineage, inheritance, and the unspoken contract that held plantation society together. White authority must remain unquestioned, even in private. Thomas had broken the rule not by touching the women, but by treating them as equals, by imagining freedom for them, by behaving as if the law didn't exist. And behind Abraham's stillness that day, behind that frozen stare, was a single truth. If the county learned of this hidden household, he would become the object of ridicule. Not the son, the father, the patriarch, the symbol of order. So he didn't think like a man betrayed. He thought like a ruler under siege. What would protect the name? What would control the narrative? What would keep the hierarchy intact, even while acknowledging the scandal? A private beating wouldn't be enough. A secret sale wouldn't erase witnesses. A quiet relocation wouldn't silence whispers. No, this required spectacle, a ritual, a public resetting of power, something so shocking, so humiliating, so theatrically controlled that the story would belong to him, not to gossip. That night, while the house slept, Abraham sat at his desk with a single candle burning and drafted his solution, one that would force his son to stand before 400 people and declare loyalty not to love, but to law. He would not erase the barn's secret. He would weaponize it. When dawn broke, the decision was already made. Abraham didn't pace. He didn't pray. He didn't wrestle with morality. Men like him didn't need moral clarity. They were the morality of their world. Whatever they decreed became proper, not because it was righteous, but because no one dared say otherwise. He summoned Thomas to breakfast. No raised voice. No trembling emotion. Just the tone a man uses when discussing an equipment order, a crop estimate, or a human life. "You will marry them," he said. "Not choose one, not free them, not leave with them. All three. Publicly. A fake marriage, legally meaningless, but socially mandatory. A ceremony designed not to bless union, but to brand ownership. A stage-built confession, the son forced into a performance of moral responsibility, while the father quietly retained the only kind of power that mattered in that world, legal possession. Thomas tried to argue about Virginia law, about the humiliation, about the children, but his father cut through every objection with one sentence that revealed exactly how deep the stakes were. "The alternative is I sell them south tomorrow, and you never see them or your children again." That was the line, the threat no one could outrun. In that era, being sold south was a death sentence disguised as commerce. Families erased, names erased, history erased. The Deep South was the final graveyard of hope. So Thomas surrendered, not because he agreed, but because there were no choices left that didn't destroy someone he loved. The next 3 days became a psychological theater. Women moved into the main house, dressed in the dead wife's clothing, fed at the family table, not elevated, not freed, just displayed, their presence transformed from secret to spectacle long before the ceremony itself. Servants whispered. Neighbors smirked behind fans. Invitations spread like wildfire. Abraham hand delivering them, controlling the framing with rehearsed phrases. The boys got strange ideals, but at least he'll do right by them. There it was again, the illusion of honor masking a deeper cruelty, because this wasn't a wedding. It was a public correction. A father dragging his son, 3 women, and 2 innocent children into the town square, not to bless them, but to brand them with narrative. Not a story of love, a story of ownership reclaimed. And the county would watch, because power always makes sure it has an audience. In those 3 days before the ceremony, the Sutherland plantation turned into something unreal, like a stage set built over a grave. Nothing looked different on the surface, the same fields, same house, same routines, but the energy had shifted. Everyone felt it. The enslaved people moved quieter. The white workers avoided eye contact. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing that land. Because everyone knew what was coming, they just didn't know why. Abraham's brilliance wasn't in force. It was in presentation. He never spoke of scandal, never acknowledged disgrace. He spoke only of responsibility, duty, making things right. And those words spread through the county like coded scripture, repeated by men who pretended not to be fascinated and women who pretended not to be horrified. But behind every polite conversation was the real question no one said aloud. What kind of man forces his own son to marry 3 enslaved women in public? A weak man wouldn't. A guilty man wouldn't. A desperate man wouldn't. Only a man who still believed he controlled God, law, and narrative would attempt such a thing. Meanwhile, Thomas lived in a quiet catastrophe. He slept in the same room with the women and their children, because Abraham required it. an act meant to normalize the arrangement publicly while privately stripping it of all intimacy. Every meal at the long table was a silent performance. The father at the head, the son beside him, the three women arranged like display pieces, the children shifting restlessly in borrowed shoes. No one spoke of Saturday. They didn't have to. The ceremony was now a living ghost walking from room to room, breathing down every throat. Even the Reverend felt it. Reverend Talbot walked the edge of panic. He knew the Bible verses Abraham would use. He knew the theological loopholes being carved into existence. He also knew that whatever happened in that square would stain his life forever. And yet, he said yes. Because in that world, refusal was more dangerous than blessing. And that is how institutional power works. It doesn't need to be loved or respected or admired. It just needs to make refusal unthinkable. By Friday night, the invitations were delivered. The clothing was chosen. The town square was prepared, and every person in Chesterfield County was ready to witness not a wedding, but a public rewriting of truth. Saturday was not a day of celebration. It was a day of containment. A ritual engineered to cauterize a wound before it could infect the social body. The sky itself seemed to understand, hanging low and metallic, the air thick with a humidity that felt less like weather and more like judgment. By 11 a.m., Courthouse Square was already full. Planters in tailored coats, wives in pressed muslin, overseers smelling of sweat and tobacco, young men who came to laugh, old men who came to measure, women who came to witness, and all of them waiting, not for unions, not for vows, but for confirmation that the world they lived in still made sense. Because if a white hair could make a family with enslaved women without consequence, what else could unravel? The courthouse bell struck once. Sharp, metallic, final. Then they appeared. Abraham walked first, not as a father but as a statesman. Every step a declaration, I am still in command. Behind him Thomas, his face pale, jaw set, shoulders squared not with pride, but with the stubborn dignity of a man who refuses to collapse, even while being broken. And beside Thomas the women, not in rags, not in chains, but in white. The gowns, once worn by Abraham's dead wife, didn't fit perfectly, couldn't hide the pregnancy, couldn't erase the truth, but that wasn't the point. The white was symbolic not of purity, but of possession. A signal that Abraham could elevate costume and display what he still legally owned. The crowd went silent, not out of respect, out of cognitive fracture. They were looking at something the system wasn't built to process. Enslaved women dressed as brides, escorted by the very man who held their lives on paper. Even Talbot, waiting at the podium, looked like he wanted to disappear into his own collar. No musicians played. No flowers were thrown. No smiles were exchanged. Just hundreds of eyes locking onto a scene no one could categorize. And that is the true nature of power, not violence. Definition. If you can define a thing, you own it. If you can name the story, you control the memory. Abraham wasn't just forcing a ceremony. He was forcing a frame, and the county had no choice but to stare. Reverend Talbot cleared his throat, but his voice didn't come right away. That's how you knew the weight of the moment wasn't just theatrical. It was spiritual whiplash. The Bible he held had blessed marriages, burials, baptisms, and wars, but never this. Even he couldn't name what he was about to officiate. Not a union, not a covenant, not even a sin, just a transaction disguised as righteousness. But Abraham had planned every inch of this. When Talbot hesitated, Abraham stepped slightly forward. Not enough to interrupt, just enough to remind him who paid for the church roof, who funded the mission fund, who signed the checks that kept his sermons floating above hunger. So the Reverend spoke, "Dearly beloved." The words fell flat the instant they left his mouth, because no one believed they were beloved, and no one pretended they were here for love. They were here because power demanded witnesses. Abraham didn't need approval. He needed documentation, public affirmation, The marriage certificates could be legally useless, but the memory, the spectacle, the social ledger written in 400 pairs of eyes, that was binding. Thomas stood still, hands clenched behind his back, refusing to let his father see them shake. But the women didn't look at Abraham. They didn't look at the crowd. Their gaze stayed fixed on the children, one squirming, one asleep, one unborn. Not brides, not criminals, not symbols, mothers. The Reverend read the vows Abraham had pre-selected, carefully edited to remove all mention of equality, rights, mutual obligation. The words were hollow, but the silence that followed them was full. No one yelled. No one laughed. No one blessed. Because every person in that square understood what they were truly witnessing. Not marriage, but retaliation wearing a veil. Abraham wasn't clearing his son's name. He was branding him. Let the county say, he didn't seduce them. He took responsibility. Let them say, he didn't hide shame. He faced it like a man. Let them say, the father handled it. Control the narrative, and you control the scandal. Control the scandal, and you survive it. But something happened in that square Abraham didn't calculate for. Something silent, invisible, but real. The crowd came expecting humiliation. What they saw looked uncomfortably close to defiance. The first fracture in Abraham's performance wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a look, a small, unplanned slip in the script. When the Reverend asked Thomas to repeat the first vow, Thomas didn't turn toward Abraham, or the crowd, or the women. He turned toward the children. Not a grand gesture. Not rebellion. Just a father, acknowledging his own blood. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, the entire balance shifted. Because the crowd wasn't looking at scandal anymore. They were looking at lineage. The unspoken understanding rippled through them. Those children on the edge of the platform were Sutherlands, no matter what color, no matter what law said, no matter what Abraham wanted to erase. The bloodline was right there in miniature, fidgeting in borrowed shoes. And suddenly, Abraham's entire spectacle began to look less like control and more like fear. What kind of patriarch needs to publicly force legitimacy? What kind of dynasty requires a stage to prove it still exists? If power has to be announced, is it still power, or the performance of what used to be? Abraham sensed it. His jaw tightened. His posture hardened. He answered the shift the only way tyrants know how, by pressing harder. Speak the vow, Thomas, he commanded. Not gently, not fatherly, but with the clipped tone of a man who had never been disobeyed in public. The crowd heard it. And that was the second fracture. Because a real patriarch doesn't beg authority. He is authority. Thomas finally repeated the vow. But the hesitation had already exposed the truth. This marriage wasn't an act of responsibility. It was punishment. A sentence disguised as ceremony. The Reverend continued, but no one was listening to him anymore. They were watching the space between father and son. The widening gap between performance and belief. They weren't asking, why is he marrying them? They were asking, what did Abraham fear enough to force this? That's when it became clear. This story wasn't about morality or scandal or even race. It was about dynasty vs. dignity. And in that moment, whether they admitted it or not, the crowd understood a dangerous possibility. Thomas might not be the broken one. It might be Abraham. The ceremony reached its final stage. The pronouncement. The moment where a union became official, where words turned into law, and witnesses turned into history. But by now, the crowd wasn't watching to see what would happen. They were watching to see what wouldn't. Reverend Talbot raised his hand to bless the marriages, but even he seemed to hesitate, caught between scripture, legality, and the quiet horror of knowing this moment would follow him into every sermon for the rest of his life. Abraham gave him the smallest nod, the kind that meant do it. Finish it. Seal it. And just as the words began to leave the Reverend's mouth, something no one planned happened. One of the children, barely 5 years old, slipped his hand into Thomas's. No one gasped. No one screamed. But it hit the square harder than any interruption could have. It shattered the illusion that this was merely a corrective act, a political move, a moral cleansing. Because now the scene wasn't 3 women and a disgraced son. It was a family. A quiet, undeniable, uncontainable fact. Abraham's worst fear, in living form. You could feel the crowd shift. Not toward applause, not toward approval, but toward awareness. They weren't being asked to witness obedience anymore. They were being forced to witness truth, and truth is the one thing even power struggles to control. Talbot's voice cracked on the final line. I now declare. But that hesitation was enough. The audience didn't hear legitimacy. They heard reluctance. They heard doubt. They heard a man trying to bless something his own soul refused to name. And that is the third fracture. When the ritual loses faith, the story loses authority. Abraham stepped forward, ready to claim victory, to finalize the fiction. But victory only exists if people believe it, and belief had just leaked out of that square like air from a punctured lung. No applause followed. No cheers rose. No social restoration occurred, just a long, heavy silence. The kind that says we saw too much. Because power can command obedience, but it cannot command interpretation. For the first time, Abraham wasn't controlling the narrative. The narrative was controlling him. When the ceremony ended, no one moved, not because they were paralyzed, but because no one knew what the correct reaction was. There were no social cues to follow, no tradition to imitate, no etiquette to rely on. Abraham had created something unprecedented, and now even he couldn't choreograph the response. The crowd dispersed in a slow, uneven drift, people walking away in silence, not out of respect but confusion. They didn't leave with a story they could repeat. They left with a question they couldn't name. Abraham expected whispers of restored order. What he got instead was the birth of a rumor he could not control. Because the town hadn't witnessed a man restoring honor, they had witnessed a man trying to bury truth in daylight. And once people see that, they never unsee it. Thomas didn't walk back with his father. He walked with the children, one holding his hand, another being carried, the unborn one shifting beneath fabric. The women followed, not behind him but beside him. Another small, unplanned rearrangement of order. The crowd noticed. Hierarchy was supposed to be rigid, but what they saw looked quietly equal. There was no victory in Abraham's posture on the platform. He stood alone, staring at the half-empty square, the weight of his own spectacle settling into him. He had won the theater, but lost the narrative. He forced a union, but revealed a fracture. That is the curse of public power. The moment you must prove it, you confess it's already threatened. Reverend Talbot closed his Bible with the air of a man who had just signed his own spiritual debt. He didn't look at Abraham on his way out. He didn't look at the crowd either. He only looked at the sky, because some men pray upward when they can't pray forward. And the county, they didn't gossip loudly. They whispered carefully. Because now the story wasn't about scandal or sin, it was about a father at war with his own lineage. And people don't forget a spectacle like that. They repeat it. They reshape it. They pass it down, not as history, but as warning. By nightfall, the plantation was quieter than it had ever been. Not peaceful, just muted, like a house holding its breath. Abraham had dismissed the workers early, sent the reverend home with a strained handshake, and closed himself inside his study. No congratulations dinner, no celebration, no toast, just a man alone with the outcome he demanded, but didn't recognize. Because power, once cracked, doesn't make a sound when it breaks, it just stops echoing. Upstairs, Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, still in the coat he'd worn to the square, too drained to remove it. The children had fallen asleep in a single pile on the rug, their exhaustion heavier than their bodies. The women moved quietly around the room, not speaking, but moving with the calm of people who had already done their grieving long before this day ever arrived. They didn't speak of the wedding. They didn't speak of Abraham. They spoke only of practical things: food, rest, tomorrow. Because survival teaches a different kind of wisdom. The understanding that the world can change in public, but living still happens in private. Thomas finally exhaled, like a man who had been holding his breath for months. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look destroyed. He looked freed of pretending. The punishment his father designed had become something else. Something Abraham could never have anticipated, a visible, undeniable claim to his own life. It wasn't dignity the ceremony gave him. It was clarity. Abraham wanted the wedding to erase scandal. Instead, it erased ambiguity. There would never again be a question of whether Thomas loved his children, whether he acknowledged the women, whether he would stand beside them. He already had. In front of the county, in front of the pulpit, in front of history, power had staged the performance. But truth had stolen the scene, and somewhere in that house, whether in the study or the dark corners of his own mind, Abraham finally understood the thing every tyrant realizes too late. You can force obedience. You can stage morality. You can command silence. But you cannot choreograph what people remember. And what Chesterfield County would remember was not the ceremony, but the crack in the man who tried to control it. By the next morning, word of the ceremony had already spread beyond the county line, not because anyone intended to spread it, but because stories like that don't stay still. They travel on breath, on disbelief, on the quiet thrill of, "You won't believe what I just saw." And every retelling shifted the focus a little further away from Abraham's intention. Some called it a wedding. Some called it a scandal. Some called it a punishment. But the most dangerous version was the one whispered by those who were not supposed to think about such things. They looked like a family. That sentence was the real threat. Not the marriage, not the race mixing, not the ceremony itself, but the recognition of humanity in a place built to deny it. Because once a thing is seen, it cannot be unseen, and the enslaved community on the Sutherland plantation felt it first. Not joy, not victory, but a strange, unfamiliar ripple of possibility, the kind of possibility that doesn't change chains, but changes minds. A reminder that even in a world where ownership is law, blood has its own rebellion. In the quarters, people spoke carefully, but with eyes lit sharper than firelight. They didn't praise Thomas, but they didn't dismiss him either. They spoke of the women, 3 of them, standing in white, unbroken. They spoke of the children being claimed instead of hidden. They spoke of the moment when the child held his father's hand, and they understood something Abraham didn't. That wasn't weakness. That was continuity. Meanwhile, Abraham received his first answer from the world, not in words, but in silence, the kind of silence that means people are no longer speaking to him, only about him. That shift, when respect turns into observation, is the beginning of social death. He had not restored the family name. He had put it on display, and now it lived outside his control. What he built to erase shame had become a monument to it, because a powerful man can survive scandal, but not exposure. And the ceremony had exposed everything: his fear, his fragility, his failure to command belief. The county would forget details over time, but they would not forget the image: a father forcing a son, and a son refusing to be erased. Some stories end with consequences, others end with silence, but this story didn't end with either. It ended with stalling, a strange, suspended kind of aftermath, where no one dared make the next move, because everyone was waiting to see what reality would solidify into. Would the marriages be recognized by law? No. Would the women be treated as wives? Also no. Would the children suddenly inherit land, name, or legitimacy? Absolutely not. But the question that seeped into the cracks of the community was far more disruptive. If the law can be bent this way once, How many other lines are just choices in disguise? That is how systems begin to rot. Not from revolt, but from doubt. Abraham tried to resume life as before. He resumed his seat at the head of the table. He resumed his orders. He resumed his posture as the unshakable patriarch. But he could not resume certainty, because every time he spoke to a guest, he saw curiosity in their eyes. Every time he passed a mirror, he saw explanation instead of authority. Every time he walked past the quarters, he felt regarded instead of feared. That is the price of making your private terror a public event. You turn your power into a spectacle, and spectacles are made to be interpreted. Thomas, meanwhile, did not rebel. He did not flee. He did not rise up. He simply lived. He walked with his children through the fields in daylight. He sat on the porch with the women without hiding. He stopped apologizing for his existence. And in a world built on the myth of racial hierarchy, that alone was resistance, because rebellion isn't always fire. Sometimes it's visibility. Sometimes it's refusing to disappear. Sometimes it's saying nothing, and still being undeniable. And so the strangest truth emerged in the weeks after the wedding. Abraham had succeeded in binding his son to a future, but he had failed to bind him to shame. The ceremony was supposed to erase scandal. Instead, it erased obedience. And for the first time in his life, Abraham was not fighting a problem. He was fighting time, because time does not stay loyal to power. Time stays loyal to whatever survives it. The irony was almost biblical. Abraham had staged a ceremony to freeze history in his favor. But history had already started moving without him. The county didn't need his version anymore. It was making its own. Some people told the story as comedy. Old Sutherland lost his mind, married his boy off to the stable. Some told it as caution. That's what happens when you let a son grow soft. Some told it as prophesy. Mark my words. That boy's children gonna inherit something, one way or another. But what no one said aloud, what floated between conversations like smoke, was the most unsettling version of all. What if the boy wasn't wrong? That was the dangerous seed. Not rebellion, not equality, not justice, possibility. Because once people imagine that a forbidden thing might not be madness, the world that forbids it starts to look weaker. Abraham tried to fix that the only way he knew, through force disguised as order. He tightened discipline on the plantation. He limited visitors. He increased patrols. He reminded everyone, verbally, financially, socially, who owned what and who answered to whom. But fear-based control only works when people still believe you are capable of anything. And the ceremony had exposed something fatal. Abraham Sutherland was no longer unpredictable. He was cornered. Even the enslaved could feel the shift. They still labored, still obeyed, still survived. But now, deep beneath the silence, they evaluated. They measured the cracks. They traded glances that asked not, "What will he do?" but, "How long can this last?" And that is the beginning of collapse. Not when the walls fall, but when people stop believing they're permanent. Thomas didn't challenge his father. He didn't need to. He simply existed where he wasn't supposed to. With his children, in daylight. With the women, unhidden. With a posture that said, "You can force my signature, but you cannot force my shame." That alone was enough to make Abraham restless in his own house. Because tyrants are not destroyed by enemies. They are undone by the people who stop fearing them. And slowly, silently, that is what was happening. The wedding hadn't broken the system. It had revealed its expiration date. What Abraham never understood, what no tyrant ever understands, is that power doesn't collapse in a single moment. It thins. It drains. It leaks out through 1,000 small humiliations that no one records. Because they don't look like revolution. They look like disobedience measured in inches. A worker who no longer rushes when called. A guest who no longer asks his opinion first. A preacher who no longer quotes him by name from the pulpit. A son who no longer asks permission to walk the land he was born on. Nothing dramatic, nothing punishable. Just the slow evaporation of fear. Abraham began to feel it in the way people paused before answering him. That pause, tunny, invisible, but devastating, meant they were no longer responding to power, but deciding how much of it they still recognized. Control doesn't die when people hate you. It dies when they stop needing you. Meanwhile, the three women, once expected to shrink after the spectacle, did the opposite. They carried themselves with a steadiness that unsettled everyone, including Abraham. They did not flaunt. They did not provoke. They simply behaved as if their place beside Thomas had been earned, not permitted, and that was the heresy. They acted like they belonged, not as property, not as shame, as presence. Even the children began to change things. They were seen, really seen, by both worlds. Too light to be ignored, too dark to be claimed, too Sutherland to be erased. Their existence forced questions the system wasn't built to answer. Who teaches them to read? Where do they sit in church? What name do they carry? Who do they inherit? Every question was a crack. Every crack was a prophecy. Abraham responded the only way a man without imagination responds, by enforcing rules no one feared anymore. He tightened order while losing influence, shouted louder while his voice mattered less, clung to reputation while reputation slipped through his fingers. Because the truth had inverted. The ceremony didn't bind Thomas to shame, it bound Abraham to exposure. He wanted history to say he controlled what happened. History was shaping up to say he feared it, and there is no redemption for a patriarch once the world sees the tremor in his hand. The first person to openly challenge Abraham wasn't a rival planter, a preacher, or even Thomas. It was a woman who technically still belonged to him. Sarah. 3 days after the ceremony, she walked, unescorted, into the front parlor of the main house while Abraham was meeting with two influential neighbors. No one announced her, no one stopped her. She simply entered, stood where a guest would stand, and addressed him by his first name. Abraham, the children need proper bedding. We'll be moving it into the east room. Not master, not sir. Not may we. A statement, not a request. One of the guests choked on his pipe smoke. The other froze, caught between outrage and fascination. They waited for the explosion, because there had to be one. A black woman speaking like a wife in a room. She wasn't even supposed to enter, but Abraham didn't rage. He didn't strike her. He didn't even stand. He just stared, because he understood instantly what the others did not. If he punished her, the story became cruelty. If he ignored her, the story became weakness. If he argued, the story became negotiation. But there was no option that preserved complete control. So he tried the fourth path, silence. And in that silence, something irreversible happened. The guests didn't see a slave being insolent. They saw a patriarch being measured. They saw a hierarchy no longer functioning the way it was advertised. They saw a woman who should have lowered her eyes, but didn't. They saw a man who should have dismissed her instantly, but couldn't. And even they, men who owned bodies, traded families, and justified all of it with scripture, felt the ground tilt. Because every system of domination survives on one illusion. Everyone must agree on who is allowed to speak. Sarah spoke, and nothing, no law, no whip, no ledger, could make that moment unspoken. Again, from that day forward, rumors spread quietly. She walks like she isn't owned. He lets her make decisions. The boy plays in the main yard now. The old man's losing his hold. A single sentence whispered in 3 different kitchens was more dangerous than any rebellion, because revolutions don't begin with fire. They begin when someone who was never meant to speak does. The county didn't fracture overnight. That's not how power structures die. They don't explode, they rot. Quietly, from the inside. And the first sign of decay wasn't confrontation. It was imitation. Within a week, 2 other plantation owners reported discipline problems among enslaved women who had witnessed the wedding. Not rebellion, confidence. They began walking with straighter backs, answering questions with full sentences, delaying obedience by seconds instead of breaths. A second or two is nothing, unless it spreads, because the human mind, even when chained, is always scanning for possibility, and possibility is contagious. One overseer wrote in a private letter, "They have seen a thing that should not exist, and now they behave as if they are waiting to see it again." That's how systems unravel, not through force, but through revised expectation. And the white men of Chesterfield County felt it. They couldn't name it, but they sensed a fracture in the invisible lines that kept their world arranged. The ceremony had not just humiliated Abraham, it had introduced instability into the language of ownership itself. If one man's property could stand beside him like a wife, if a son could acknowledge enslaved children as his own blood, if a black woman could walk into a parlor and speak without permission, then what exactly was left unquestionable? The answer terrified them nothing. Meanwhile, Thomas, who thought the ceremony was a temporary humiliation, was only beginning to grasp the deeper shift. His plan had been escape, quiet, hopeful, far-off freedom. But the ceremony had ripped that option away. He could no longer leave quietly. Too many eyes were on him now. Too many stories had attached to his name. He had become a symbol. Not by choice, not by courage, by exposure. And symbols don't get to choose the war they're dragged into. The women understood this before he did. Sarah watched the house staff whisper. Rebecca watched the overseer hesitate before giving orders. Mary noticed how even white children stared at her differently. First with confusion, then fascination, then something like respect they didn't understand. That's when she said the sentence that would change everything. "He didn't free us. The crowd did." Because once witnesses exist, silence is no longer obedience. It's negotiation. The shift was subtle, but it was everywhere. Like a pulse under the floorboards, no one could unhear. And the man who felt it most wasn't Thomas. It wasn't the women. It wasn't even Abraham. It was the courthouse clerk, the same trembling, handed official who had been forced to document the marriages. Now found himself at the crossroads of a quiet crisis. Because 3 days after the ceremony, something unprecedented happened. A free black man from Richmond arrived at the clerk's office and asked, calmly, to view the record. Not to challenge it, not to protest it, to see it. The clerk refused, of course. The record was sealed, by Abraham's request, by the judge's silence, by the weight of custom. But refusal wasn't the point. The question was the threat. If a document exists, someone can demand its legitimacy. If a ceremony was witnessed, someone can testify to its truth. If a man's son stood before God and named 3 enslaved women as wives, then no matter how illegal the marriage was in Virginia, a claim now existed, a claim to dignity, a claim to lineage, a claim to inheritance. Because in the eyes of the public, Thomas had made the children Sutherlands, and blood, once acknowledged, is legally messy in ways money fears. Abraham didn't panic, not outwardly, but he did something far more revealing than anger. He started writing letters. To lawyers in Richmond, to legislators he'd funded, to judges who owed favors, to planners who shared his dread of legal ambiguity. He wasn't trying to undo the wedding, he was trying to assassinate the meaning of it. But letters can't erase memory. They can't ring a bell heard by 400 witnesses. They can't force silence into the mouths of men who live on gossip and hierarchy. And slowly, the county split. Not along race, but control. Some saw the ceremony as an absurdity and wanted to bury the incident, never spoken of again. Others saw it as a precedent, a dangerous loophole where law couldn't dictate status, where performance alone could bend the social order. But a small, growing number, enslaved and free, saw something else entirely, a virus inside the system. If one patriarch could be forced to publicly humanize his property, how long before the performance turned into expectation? How long before expectation became pressure? How long before pressure became collapse? When a lie is old enough, it stops needing to be spoken. It becomes architecture, built into walls, laws, rituals, expectations, and nothing frightens the architects more than seeing someone walk straight through a door they were never meant to open. That's what the ceremony was. Not a marriage, not a scandal, a doorway. And the first to walk through it weren't the enslaved, or the planters, or even Thomas. It was the quiet observers, the ones who never speak first, but always speak last. Black preachers, midwives, field hands who'd lived long enough to see revolts rise and die. White women who heard things at sewing circles their husbands thought they never understood. These were the ones who recognized the deeper truth. Abraham hadn't defended the system. He had betrayed it. Not out of morality, not out of mercy, out of fear. He proved that even the strongest master would rather rewrite custom than lose control of blood. And that meant something powerful. If the old laws could bend once, they could bend again. And once something bends, it stops being sacred. The enslaved didn't riot. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They just watched. The way a prisoner watches a guard drop the keys. Because control doesn't end when the oppressed fight back. It ends when the oppressed wait, knowing time favors them now. Meanwhile, Thomas began to understand the cost of what he'd triggered. Strangers stared at him in town, not with curiosity anymore, but calculation. Some saw him as a threat, others as an idiot. A few, disturbingly, as an example. One planter even approached him at a tavern, half joking, half testing. You think public claiming turns them into wives, or just keeps the peace? Thomas didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because he finally did. The wedding wasn't containment, it was contagion. A living demonstration that ownership was fragile, identity was fluid, and the script of power could be rewritten. If the audience witnessed the rewriting, Abraham had forced a ritual meant to lock the world back into order. Instead, he created the first public crack in its mythology. And the people who lived beneath that mythology were beginning to hear the timber split. The first sign that the world was shifting didn't come from the plantation, or the courthouse, or even the newspapers. It came from the auction block. 3 weeks after the ceremony, a slave trader from North Carolina rode into Sutherland County expecting business as usual. He had papers, chains, and a ledger, like every other man in his line of work. But when he visited the nearby estates, he heard the same quiet refusal. No, for now, we're not selling anyone. Not because the owners had grown compassionate. Not because the market had slowed, but because no one wanted to risk buying someone with an inheritance claim. It didn't matter that the law said enslaved people were property. It didn't matter that the courts would never honor a marriage between a white man and enslaved women. What mattered was uncertainty. Uncertainty makes bankers hesitate, makes lawyers nervous, makes men with assets suddenly see chains as liabilities. You hear about Sutherland's boy. The trader was told again and again. He married 3 of his slaves. 3, said it in front of God and everybody. Named their children. Named them what? The trader asked. Sutherland's. The word didn't need explanation. A surname was more than a name. It was a weapon. A child with a last name wasn't livestock. A child with a last name could stand in court. If not now, then someday. A child with a last name turned the future into a courtroom waiting to happen. That was the real aftermath of the wedding. It infected the economy. Abraham Sutherland didn't just lose face. He had accidentally created the most feared thing in the slave-holding South, a precedent tied to money. Because if one planter's son could be forced to acknowledge enslaved children as heirs, what stopped the next? What stopped a will, a witness, a Bible entry, a dying confession? The slave trader rode back to his inn with a stunned, furious question. What happens when property starts making legal claims against its owner? Nobody answered him. Nobody could. The only truth was this: the wedding wasn't a joke. It wasn't an anomaly. It was a financial virus, the kind that spreads in silence and destroys loudly, and the first men to feel it weren't the enslaved. They were the ones who thought they were untouchable. Abraham Sutherland had spent his life believing that danger came from below, from the fields, from rebellion, from the people whose voices the law refused to hear. But now the danger was coming from men who looked like him, dined like him, voted like him, men who now whispered that he had broken rank with the class that protected him. Because once property becomes a legal risk, the master himself becomes expendable. Plantation society ran on a single shared illusion. We all agree to protect each other's power, or none of us have any. Abraham shattered that agreement, not with mercy, not with ideology, but with a spectacle that made other planters fear courtrooms more than uprisings. Now letters were returning to him, cold, clipped, formal. Your recent domestic affairs have created complications. We urge caution in your son's conduct going forward. There is concern that this situation may invite legal agitation. The word they would not write, but all implied, was abolition. Not the northern kind, not the moral kind, the legal kind. The kind that starts when a single enslaved child stands in front of a judge and asks, "Is my father a white man? Then what am I?" That question was dynamite. And then came the real blow. 2 neighboring planters withdrew their signatures from a joint petition Abraham had been preparing. One that was meant to expand patrol funding and restrict travel for free black people, not out of principle, out of self-preservation. Why strengthen laws on movement when one of their own had blurred the legal meaning of status itself? Thomas, meanwhile, was learning a different lesson. Ritual creates responsibility. The women he had married were no longer invisible. They had identities, roles, expectations. Even the other enslaved people on the plantation began treating them differently, not as merely favored, but as named, and a named woman is adored too. She gives birth not only to children, but to claims. Thomas could feel it every time he walked into the quarters. He wasn't just a master now. He was a husband. And a husband is accountable. But the most dangerous shift of all wasn't legal, social, or financial. It was psychological. For the first time, enslaved people weren't imagining freedom. They were imagining leverage. And once a mind stops dreaming of escape and starts planning negotiation, the system is already bleeding.